just as introduced, what impressive background, Pacman. Thank you very much, and it's a great honor for us to have you joining us. I'm not sure whether you are joining from, but welcome, welcome. And also, do you have any message for our fellow Web3 community members attending Foresight 2024?
Yeah, Jim, ni hao, ni hao. Thanks everyone for having me here. Really excited to participate in the discussion today in Q&A.
Yeah, and I also know that your team has been super busy building ahead of the event. So could you also share with us some of your latest and most exciting developments around Blast and Blur?
Yeah, totally. I'll start with Blast first. So the core vision for Blast is to build out the full stack chain. And what the full stack chain is if you look at every chain today, whether it's an L1 or an L2 chain, they all pretty much have the same user experience, and that they onboard via a SEX, then they have to be accessed via a wallet, typically a different desktop and mobile wallet, and then they have to finally get onto the chain itself, and then they are able to get onto the application. This current UX layer is highly fragmented across many different services and providers, and it creates a very high level of friction for any new user coming into the space. So if anyone has built any sort of like consumer-facing application in the past, you'll know that any level of friction is typically going to create incredibly high drop-off rates in terms of conversion from new users. So what Blast is focused on specifically is creating a fully integrated stack that allows new users to come onto applications, through one vertical stack instead of having to go through multiple different service providers. So that's the core focus on Blast, and a key component of that is the release of the Blast app, which is a mobile-first application platform for all applications on Blast. And then on the Blur side, unfortunately, we are very private about what we released there. We usually don't share anything public until we're ready to release. I can say that we are working on the biggest project that we have worked on in Blur's history to date. So I'm very excited to share more about that, but we're not able to share more until that's closer to launch.
Yeah, it's so great to hear about that. And you mentioned about the L2. Actually, during Foresight 2024, we do have several panels and keynotes talking about L2. And Blast is also one of the most popular and established L2 on Ethereum. So what do you see as the biggest challenges and also opportunities in the realm of L2?
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear if you look at L1 activity data versus L2 activity data, more and more of L1 activity and liquidity is going to shift over onto L2s. I think the most important challenge and the opportunity is that in order for L2s to be truly interesting, they need to enable truly new applications that can only exist on L2s, and that can't really exist on L1. And for most L2s, that's something that's very difficult to achieve. This is why for Blast, we really focus on creating new primitives and building blocks that would be useful for developers to create new applications. So those two building blocks are one, native yield, and that all ETH on Blast is automatically earning yield. So if you have one ETH today, it becomes 1.04 ETH automatically in a year. And then also the gas fee sharing. So Blast is the only L2 where all of the gas fees generated by applications are actually redirected to the developers themselves instead of going to a centralized foundation, which is what most L2s do for the gas fee revenue. And so these new building blocks basically give developers new primitives to experiment with. I think the most important thing for any L2 is to enable new applications, because otherwise there's not really a huge reason for liquidity and users to move over from an L1 to an L2 outside of that.
As I was preparing and doing some homework for this fireside chat, I also read some news around Pacman, which is a program initially Blast migrating to Solana. So how do you address those kind of competition and project migration?
Yeah, ultimately for each individual project, it's always a decision for them in terms of evaluating what's the best chain for them at that moment in time. I remember back in summer last year, so summer of 23, many projects on Solana ended up migrating over to Ethereum. The big ones were DGods and Rollbit. And when they migrated over to Ethereum, they were it was something that was like very applauded for those projects to do that, because Solana at the time was kind of a ignored chain to a certain extent. And then a few months later, Solana ended up really growing in terms of the user base and developers. And then those projects that moved off ended up kind of having to either migrate back or they kind of regretted their decision. So in terms of projects migrating, it's something that is fairly common. Whichever chain a project feels is the best chain for them typically is going to change based on what point in time it is in the cycle. So in terms of projects, like Pacman, ultimately I think it's very important for every single project to always evaluate, what is the best chain for them. And if they think that migrating is better for them, in the short to medium term, then that's a very fair, decision to make. I think for a lot of other projects, they decide that the migration hassle is usually not worth it, and that it's actually better to kind of double down on a single chain and basically bet on that single chain growing over time. So there's a lot of different strategies, and typically when we work with founders and builders, we try to objectively advise them on the merits to each of the different strategies, so that they can make a fair evaluation on their own in terms of which strategy to take.
Yeah, that's fair enough. But with that being said, do you have any plan to make Blast even more attractive destinations for builders? We have so many innovative people, builders, developers across the globe. So I think they will be more than eager to learn more about you. About it, I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. So for us, when we think about what's useful for builders, we really like to think from our own perspective first, because our initial experience in Web3 is originally as a dApp builder, right? So my co-founder and I, we first built Blur, which is the #1 NFT marketplace on Ethereum. So that went from 0 to one of the most used dApps on Ethereum. So we really understand the builder mindset. And something that we created for builders is, first the two primitives that I mentioned, which is the native yield and the gas fee sharing. So those are two benefits and incentives that you get on Blast that you don't get anywhere else. And then the other thing that's very unique about Blast is the incentives. The incentives on Blast are very explicit in terms of implicit. And what I mean by that is that we have an explicit points and gold program that developers can plug into in order to incentivize their users. And something that we've been doing over time is actually making those incentives more powerful by basically allowing builders to use them in a more flexible way. So in phase 1, which was our last season of airdrop incentives, we had a lot of restrictions in terms of how the gold was used. That's the primary, incentive currency that Blast has created. We had a lot of restrictions in terms of how gold was used. Over time, as we've kind of learned more and more about what works and what doesn't work, we've actually opened up the space in terms of the different ways in which gold can be used. And so what this has been doing has been giving developers more freedom over how they can actually use the incentives that Blast gives them. And again, these incentives that Blast gives are basically the only explicit layer level incentives that exist in this space. So we really like to work with our projects a lot in terms of helping them develop their product and giving product feedback as product builders ourselves. And we also give them incentive feedback and go-to-market feedback because very few teams in the space have gone and launched an application from 0 to 100 end to end. And fortunately, we have gone through that experience, and so we like to get really hands-on in terms of helping our builders, take advantage of the incentives and optimizing their product to make sure that they have the best launch possible.
Yeah, since you already mentioned about incentives, let's talk about, as one of the pioneers of the points incentive model, how do you view the value this model has generated from protocols? After implementing points incentives, how can user retention rates be ensured and improved?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the very important thing to understand about points programs is that they're not for retention, because every single point program has to end eventually. So the important thing is actually to understand what your retention rate is outside of the point program. So for Blur, for example, Blur actually stayed in private beta for 6 months before launching, and there was no point or airdrop program during those 6 months. So we actually knew before launching the points program exactly how good the retention was. And the retention was best in class. The 30-day visitor retention was in the 40 to 60% range, and the 30-day transaction retention was in the 30 to 50% range. It differed based on the different cohorts, but prior to launching the point program, we already knew that the retention of Blur was best in class. We knew that there was true product market fit. Now, then you have to ask, what is the point of the point program? Well, the point of the point program is basically to accelerate market adoption, basically making it so that the market can reach the value of and acquire the value that Blur will provide them as quickly as possible. And the way that we did that was by quantifying to the user exactly how much they were effectively using Blur. And the more that they used Blur, the more that they would be able to earn points towards the eventual airdrop. So the point program was not a retention motion. It was very much a growth go-to-market motion, and it's very important to not mix that up, because if you try to do a point program as a retention motion, it's going to eventually fail because the points will eventually go away. So you really, really need the retention to be good before you do any of this.
Yeah, I also hear you mention about the summer. Maybe it's about the season, but it made me just think of how Blur got established. That's around like NFT summer. Right now, the whole crypto market actually recover a bit, but with NFT market as a whole actually lagging a lot. So, what do you think needs to be done to further revitalize the NFT market?
Yeah, I think there's two ways that NFTs kind of come back heavily. One is just normal market rotations. So if you think about this cycle, the thing about this cycle that's kind of interesting is that it's not really been a cycle that has mirrored how previous cycles have worked. So typically, if you look at all the previous cycles, they came about because there were fundamental changes in the market structure and the primitives. So in 2017, Ethereum enabled ICOs, right? And it made it 100x easier to launch tokens and get them into the market. If you look at 2020, with the launch of Uniswap, it finally became possible to create a market around tokens on chain and to launch tokens, without a SEX listing. That was another huge unlock, and that enabled the entire DeFi summer. If you look at 2021, NFTs were finally invented, and this was a new type of asset that didn't exist before. If you look at this cycle, there hasn't really been any new fundamental innovation. A lot of this cycle has been driven by ETF buy pressure. So this cycle hasn't really played out like previous cycles because it hasn't really been a real cycle in the sense of fundamental technology changes creating a new wave of adoption. And typically what we've seen when there have been those types of cycles is that there is a rotation from, first the majors to the alts and then to, new asset classes like NFTs. So I think one aspect of it is you just see a real cycle occur and then you see the capital rotation. I think another angle is typically when there's new primitives and new types of assets that exist that are twists on previous assets, those are the types of assets that actually gain the most traction. So you think about NFTs were a twist on fungible tokens. There have been new attempts at new types of NFT-related asset classes like ERC 404s as an example, but there hasn't really been something truly novel that is, an NFT related, but creating something new. So I think that when a new asset class is created that is, NFT related, but with a new twist, I think that's something that's going to likely create a new wave for, NFT related adoption.
Yeah, and now you'll only have Blur, but also Blast. So you're in charge of the two very popular and very significant projects in this realm. I'm really curious, how do you allocate your time, energy, effort to those two projects to ensure they got enough attention needed?
Yeah, it's a great question. So to be honest, I've been very lucky in that typically I start from the market and work backwards. And we think about, given the knowledge that we have about the market, what would be the best thing to build? And as we've thought through what those things have been, it's always been related to both Blur and Blast. So first, if you think about Blast came about because on the Blur side, we started looking at, my co-founder and I, we looked at all the different L2s. We talked to a lot of different L2 teams. What we found was that none of the L2s were particularly compelling to us as builders. At the same time, we had a lot of experience with the different chains and experience building a dApp from scratch. And we knew that it was possible to create an L2 that was more powerful for applications. And so that's where the chain with native yield came from. It wasn't because we wanted to build an L2, it was because we realized that there was a real gap in the market that no one else was really building towards. And so we went and built it. Similarly, when we look at the opportunities that exist today, on the one hand, on the Blast side, we've shared publicly the full stack chain. This full stack chain is something that is beneficial to all applications on Blast, including Blur. So it's very related in that sense. And then on the Blur side, there's other opportunities that we've seen that are actually very related to Blast as well. So I think that if the Blur and Blast were different, wildly different projects, and I really had to choose between one or the other, it would create a very difficult building situation. But fortunately, Blur and Blast have been quite related in that a lot of the market opportunities actually have a lot of overlap between both projects, and so there hasn't really been a difficulty in terms of allocating time, just because there's been so much overlap in terms of the market opportunities.
Yeah, last but not least question. We all know that you are a paradigm-backed project, but it seems that you have very different ideas regarding airdrop and some other important decisions compared to your major backer. So how do you navigate and deal with those kind of pressures coming from investors, but at the same time maintain your own vision as a builder in this room? Do you have any suggestions to the builders here?
Yeah, fortunately, Paradigm is typically quite supportive in terms of, if their founder portfolio company wants to do something, they're kind of just supporting them in doing that. For me as a founder, at the end of the day, no investor really dictates the roadmap. They can't dictate the roadmap because they're not the one responsible for it. So I think it's very important to, allow all stakeholders to share a point of view. But at the end of the day, if you're, the main driver behind a project, it has to be your call because it's your responsibility. So I think, fortunately, it's always important to take inputs from everywhere, whether that's an investor, whether that's a user, whether that's someone random on Twitter. It's useful to just source your inputs and data from everywhere. But at the end of the day, you also have to integrate that information and synthesize it and actually make a decision, on your own, because you're the only one that's going to be responsible for the outcome at the end of the day as a creator.
Yeah, thank you so much. Time is limited, so we have to conclude the conversation here. But I do hope that we will find the time to chat very soon. Thank you so much for your time. So give the stage back to Bianca. Thank you, Pacman.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Pacman.